Hey everyone, Mike Brazier with the Ducks Unlimited podcast here. As we get into season 5 here in the next few weeks, we will be releasing a series of episodes covering the historic drought in the western U.S. One of the most important landscapes in those discussions is going to be the Klamath Basin. To help orient you to the region, we are going to be re-releasing 3 episodes from season 3 in which we discussed some of the history of the Klamath Basin and how it is shaping some of the events unfolding these days. We encourage you to listen to these episodes as they lay the foundation for a deeper understanding and appreciation for the intricacies of the conversations that will follow. This is episode 2 of 3.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we're going to be continuing our discussion about the Klamath Basin, its historical importance to waterfowl, some of the developments and changes that have occurred in that basin over the years, and where we are today. It's a very important story with respect to contemporary waterfowl management, and it is the focus of some of Ducks Unlimited's highest priority conservation actions. And understanding the history of that basin and what has happened and is happening to waterfowl habitats is certainly important for understanding why it is so important to Ducks Unlimited. To help us again with this conversation, I'm happy to welcome in Dr. Dave Mauser, retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supervisory wildlife biologist from the Klamath Basin National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and Dr. Mark Petrie, Ducks Unlimited's Director of Conservation Planning for the Western Region. Dave and Mark, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
The first thing that I need to do on this episode is to tell our listeners that if you have not listened to the episode prior to this one, stop listening to this one and go back and listen to that other one, because you're certainly going to need the background in order to understand what's going on here. It is one of the more complex stories of waterfowl habitat changes and complexities that I've encountered, and glad to have some help discussing this. So, Dave, where we left off, we were kind of tracing activities in this region from the turn of the century up through the turn of the 19th century up to the mid 20th century. So I know there are some. I know we've kind of talked offline about how the 1950s was a good year for some of these, for multiple refuges there. But before I get you to kind of tell that story about how the era when both refuges were functioning well, I wanted to touch on botulism. I mentioned in episode 1 that we're eventually going to talk about that as an avian disease that has reared its head here actually this year, and has some implications for the work that needs to be done out there. But this year's occurrence of avian botulism was not the first time we saw that out there. Anyone that knows about botulism will certainly be able to piece together that when we start lowering water levels in areas that have high densities of waterfowl, that's not a good recipe if you're wanting to minimize the probabilities of a botulism outbreak. So, Dave, what do the records tell us about botulism out in the Klamath Basin during the years when maybe some of those lakes started to dry up?
When I really started to see botulism as an issue in the basin was in some of the writings in the 30s. And it was principally on Teal Lake, because at that time Lower Klamath was dry, had been drained. And it had to deal with return flows coming from the irrigation project into the refuge, and water levels were up, water levels were down in the heat of the summer. Very attractive place for birds. And the refuge spent considerable time picking up dead birds and rehabbing birds in duck hospitals.
Okay, so that would have been in the 1930s, and I would imagine just in the intervening years when you had low water and high duck concentrations, you were at risk of those at that again. And so that became an important reason for wanting to kind of make sure we had reliable water supply in some of those refuges, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Reliable supply and a timely supply, so that it came to you in the quantities you wanted it, so you could manage your water.
On the previous episode, we talked about the tunnel that brought some of that return flow water from Teal Lake over to Lower Klamath Lake to kind of restore some of the wetland habitats there. What happened after that point? Is that when we started to see both refuges functioning really well?
Yeah, what happened was prior to the tunnel being in, Teal Lake had expanded to a very large size due to the return flows, and water levels, as I mentioned, were up, we're down, we're up, we're down. Well, those are perfect germination conditions for emergent marshes too. And so there was tremendous areas of emergent marshes, 10,000 acres on Teal Lake or more of emergent marsh, and very, very attractive for waterfowl. But the tunnel through the hills started draining that off over the Lower Klamath. Now, on the Lower Klamath side, they were in the process, the Fish and Wildlife Service, of being ready to receive that water into a series of management units where they could control water levels to some degree. So on the Lower Klamath side, you had early successional marshes that were just developing. They were very productive, very attractive waterfowl. And you still had that going on to a very large degree over on Teal Lake. And so that's why I say both refuges in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, were both firing at the same time, so to speak. And duck populations were high then, and particularly pintails. And some of the census numbers were really mind-boggling.
Yeah, that would have been the era of like the 6 or 7 million birds in the Klamath Basin.
Yeah. Yes, especially the pintails.
I seem to recall one count at Teal Lake. I think it was in the late 1950s, maybe 1957, where they counted over 3 million pintail on Teal Lake alone, which is about as many pintails that are alive in North America today, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to believe. I should mention, too, that at the same time, these wetlands there was also a lot of, the first thing they would plant generally after they reclaimed wetlands was small grains. And, farming technology isn't what it was, and it was a little more primitive back then. So harvest was sloppier. The varieties tended to lodge more. So there was a lot of waste grain in the fields. And between the productive wetlands and the grain fields immediately adjacent, it was a smorgasbord for the ducks.
I bet you a lot of our listeners would pay a lot of money to go back in time to that era and be able to witness something like that. It's hard to fathom that many birds in such a small area, small region.
Well, yes, and some indication of that is it's mentioned in a lot of the rationale for establishing those refuges in the early 20th century was to control hunting, either market hunting or plume hunting or even sport hunting. There simply wasn't enough closed zone, for example, for the birds, or the hunting was just wide open in terms of market hunting. So a lot of the rationale in the early days was excessive hunting. There was just so many birds, and it was so attractive to so many hunters.
Dave, let's move on here to at least something that I read that I think led to a significant piece of legislation in the 1960s. But as late as the 1950s, I read something in the information that you and Mark shared prior to this, suggesting that there were still desires to homestead additional acreage there in or around Teal Lake or Lower Klamath Lake in the 1950s. And so basically you still have some conflict going on in that era about whether we should be using this for agricultural interest or wildlife interest. Is that what was happening in the 50s? Did that resurface? And is that eventually what led to some legislation in the 60s?
Yeah. What happened was that since the refuge lands were still subject to reclamation being there first, the Bureau of Reclamation and the agricultural purposes. Once the tunnel went through transferring water from Teal Lake to Lower Klamath, the Bureau was able to shrink the size of the body of water that was Teal Lake into a pair of return flow sumps. But it opened up 20,000+ acres of land that then could be reclaimed for agriculture. And the blueprint that the Bureau had been using was that as they reclaim land, they would lease it for farming for a while until they fine-tuned the irrigation infrastructure, and then they would homestead it. And that was the process as the lake shrank down. And so when the tunnel went in between Teal Lake and Lower Klamath, that enabled them to go inside established refuge boundaries to propose homesteading. And of course, that sparked quite a controversy because it happened right at a time when bird populations, waterfowl populations, were in that 5 to 7 million bird range or population range, and so it created quite a lot of consternation among burgeoning environmental groups in those days, especially in the early 60s, and led to ultimately the passage of the Teal Act.
Yeah, Dave, before we get to the Teal Act, I wanted to touch on the sumps that you mentioned, because those are going to be referenced here going forward in some pretty important ways. Tell us a bit more about that. Are they exactly as they sound? I mean, when I think of a sump, I think of an area that's a bit lower in elevation and serves as a receiving basin and holding basin for water. Are these sumps a bit lower in elevation than some of the surrounding land?
Initially, they were the lowest parts of the project. But yeah, as agricultural return flows, in other words, water that flowed off the fields and wasn't used. In general, in agriculture, you want to apply more water than is actually the crop will need, because you want to keep salts moving away from the plants in the fields. Otherwise, salts start to build up in the soil. So these sumps was where those agricultural return flows would end up. And they were diked off, levied off, steep-sided, rip-wrapped impoundments. That's what they look like. They still do.
Okay. Then take us to the 1960s and tell us about the Teal Act and the significance of it, what it did.
Well, the Teal Act was, again, what the Bureau had proposed to homestead and transfer to private ownership sections of both Tule Lake and Lower Klamath, and continue work on development of the Klamath project. And the Teal Act stopped that homesteading process, permanently put those refuge lands, kept them as national wildlife refuges. However, those lands that were being talked about for homesteading were supposed to continue as lease lands for farming, leased to local farmers for farming. And so the Teal Act basically, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was in favor of the Teal Act because they saw that mixture of leased farmland that was there then and the sumps that were productive at that time was a great recipe for waterfowl. The populations were high. And so they sought to essentially freeze those refuges in time. So anyway, yeah, the Teal Act basically stopped further development of the project and put the refuges under Fish and Wildlife Service control, or permanently in governmental ownership, I should say, and stopped the homesteading process. But it did say that the two return flow sumps would stay where they're at. The lease land farming program would be allowed to continue, quote, consistent with proper waterfowl management.
Now, Mark, I want to come to you now for some thoughts on this. I've seen some presentations that you've given on this particular topic, and I know the Teal Act is a pretty significant point in time. And so, what can you add to this from the standpoint of the implications of what the Teal Act did relative to productivity of those wetlands for waterfowl?
Sure. Well, the Teal, as Dave said, Mike, the Teal Act was well intentioned. It recognized the continental importance of the refuges, and it sought to kind of maintain those. So it one of the things it did, of course, was it stopped homesteading. But it also took special interest in those two sumps on Tule Lake, and it recognized that those were fundamentally important to the large numbers we'd seen during the 1950s. And so it wanted to preserve those sumps. And as Dave said, once you stabilize water levels in these big wetlands, they become successively less productive over time. So although their intentions were good, they essentially put Tule Lake in a waterfowl time capsule. And to some extent, where it remains today, the water levels in those sumps have really been stagnant for a number of years, at least in Sump 1A, which is a very large sump. And so essentially over time, those sumps became less productive, and hence Tule Lake became less attractive to waterfowl. and we would never again see those large numbers of birds we saw in the 1950s, some of which was driven by just the decline in continental pintail populations. But the refuge just became less productive over time, partially as a result of the Keekel Act, which again was well-intentioned, but really didn't understand what water stabilization would do to those sumps.
Now, Mark, you mentioned the sump 1A is a very large sump. What are we talking about in terms of size?
Well, Dave, I think sump 1A is about 11,000 acres and sump 1B is around 3,500 acres. Does that sound right?
Yeah, sump 1A might be a little bit smaller than that, but that's close. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. I wanted some additional insight from you on that, because I know what happened there as a result of the Keekel Act and the loss of productivity of those sumps on Tule Lake becomes really important whenever we start to talk about the work that Ducks Unlimited is trying to kind of help bring about. And so I just want to make sure we were clear on that. So Dave, what then happened after the Keekel Act, Tule Lake, we talked about here, began this long-term decline in productivity as a result of this, well-intentioned, as we've said. What about Lower Klamath? What was its fate following the Keekel Act? Kind of how did it progress in terms of productivity and bird use and reliability of water?
Well, Lower Klamath was much less affected by the Keekel Act than Tule Lake was. Much more of the land was essentially left up to the Fish and Wildlife Service to manage as they saw fit, provided they could get the water. And so, it was able to, essentially use more modern techniques for wetland management and use the best science available and a better variety of wetlands. And over time, consider the needs of other wetland wildlife species and, better integration maybe of farming within your wetlands. And so anyway, it maintained its productivity and use fairly well. And it was, it's interesting. It's one of the first things I saw when I got to Lower Klamath was that the viewing a graph of waterfowl use on Tule Lake over time versus Lower Klamath. It's like, wow, this is amazing. What has happened to Tule Lake. And, we started attempting to do whatever we could to try to enhance the wetland productivity there. Along Ducks Unlimited helped us with a really big project on sump 1B, the lower sump, that was very successful. But yeah, anyway, we were just able to manage Lower Klamath. On Tule Lake, your ability to manage is much less because, number one, all the project facilities and water come from the Bureau of Reclamation. The facilities on the refuge itself are operated under contract by the Tule Lake Irrigation District. And then the refuge kind of manages the hunting program and some lure crop programs, I'll call them, to try to alleviate depredation on the agricultural lands.
Mike, you think about how much we've learned about managing wetlands since the 1960s and how much we've learned about producing food on wetlands for ducks since the 1960s, really over the last 50 or 60 years. They were able to put that knowledge into play on Lower Klamath. Refuge staff were much less opportunity to do that on Tule Lake because of the Keekel Act and what it determined the sumps needed to be or needed to look like. So really very much a tale of two cities when it came to the two refuges in terms of wetland management. Is that a fair statement, Dave?
Yeah, it is. What I noticed during my tenure there is if you could do some wetland management on Tule Lake, the soils are so much better on the Tule Lake side that the wetland response is faster. And oftentimes the bird use is, and the response of seasonal marsh plants, for example, sago, pondweed, all those things, it is really much greater over on Lower Klamath. But you get the opportunity to play with marsh management on Tule Lake a lot less than you do on Lower Klamath.
Mike, you mentioned, or Dave might have mentioned sump 1B, the smaller sump, and the fact that in the early 2000s, I think, Dave, maybe 2002, that sump was drained and the wetland response was phenomenal. In fact, the first time I met Dave, almost 20 years ago, and I just arrived in the West, and my boss sent me to the Klamath Basin. And the first time, which is where I met Dave. And Dave, as I recall, we walked around sump 1B, sump 1B, I guess. And it was a huge moist soil unit, really. There was just tremendous food production. So certainly, given the ability, that sump could certainly produce a lot of food.
Yeah, it went, when we first started that project, we worked with the irrigation district and the Bureau and Ducks Unlimited. They were instrumental in helping us with that project. It was a wide open sheet of water. It hadn't been uncovered in, I forget, 60 years, I think. Very little wildlife use. And the first year's response was kind of weak because there's no seed bank there because it's been underwater for 60 years. But there's enough plants to set seed for the following year. By year 2, it was smart weed over your head. It was phenomenal. And then the emergence started really coming on in year 3 and year 4. And now it's full of colonial water birds and molting waterfowl and waterfowl broods. And it's a very productive place.
And that was in the early 2000s. So we kind of skipped a few decades there. I want to go back a bit. We're going to come back to that. It was a pretty exciting part of this story and has some implications for some of the other proposed and ongoing work. But so after the Keuchel Act, we have these different trajectories, tale of two cities, as Mark described it. And so Lower Klamath was rocking along, doing well, getting water from Upper Klamath, from Upper Klamath Lake, as I think I recall correctly, for its irrigation purposes. But then the story kind of takes a turn, I believe, in the 1990s. So, Dave, take us through that interesting decade. What happened in the 90s that began to change the story, not necessarily for the good, from a waterfowl perspective?
Oh boy, it seemed like all the cards were against us, so to speak. But, prior to the 90s, the biggest problem we had on Lower Klamath was too much water. We couldn't get rid of it. And the Klamath project was an abundant supplier of return flows from Teal Lake pumped through the hill to Lower Klamath. And sometimes that got in the way of us doing various marsh management activities because you're to drain wetlands for seasonal marsh purposes or other management purposes. You need a canal, and oftentimes the canal is full of water because you're getting it delivered to you at the same time. So anyway, that's a side story. But there was an abundance of return flows, and a lot of that was due to power rates in the project were really cheap. And there was no competing demands for water. So there was not a real incentive for high degrees of water conservation. So there was abundant water. But we get to the early 1990s, late, what was it, 1988, I believe, the Lost River and Short-Nosed Sucker were listed as endangered in Upper Klamath Lake. Then we get to the early 90s, and we get some drought years. And the Bureau has to start preparing biological opinions under the Endangered Species Act for managing the suckers in Upper Klamath Lake. This is where the two endangered fish live. And it's also the main source of water for the Klamath Project and the lower refuges, Teal Lake and Lower Klamath. So at first, the biological opinion it was in 1992, and it was the Bureau could go to a fairly low lake level on the storage reservoir of Upper Klamath Lake, and they could, in 2 years out of 10, there was some flexibility. They could even go below that. Well, as we went further into the 90s, the minimum lake elevations to protect the suckers got more and more strict, and they got higher. And and then in the late 1990s, we list the coho salmon in the Klamath River, which is the downstream of Upper Klamath Lake. So you have two almost competing needs of endangered species in the river for the coho salmon and the lake for the suckers. So what used to be an ag first, and then the refuges received the return flows from agriculture, turned into endangered fish in the lake, endangered fish in the river. And then you also had an increased acknowledgement of the rights of Native Americans for subsistence, of fishery subsistence in particular.
Dave, I think to me that struck me as an important part of this story, to make sure we mentioned the Native American interest in both, well, I guess all three of these fish species. I mean, they're protected under the Endangered Species Act just for that purpose alone, became listed under the ESA. But then there, as you mentioned, there are also some pretty strong Native American cultural interest in those fish as well, right?
Right. The Klamath tribes on Upper Klamath Lake have subsistence rights to those suckers that are endangered, and the Yurok and Karuk tribes on the lower river have subsistence rights to the salmonids in the Klamath River. So, it was another level. So, irrigated ag and the refuges being 1 and 2, it's shifted to 3 and 4, and so then all of a sudden the Klamath Project has to start becoming a lot more efficient with their water use. And so the return flows start to dry up, of which the refuge lives on. And so anyway, it started tightening up for the refuge. And then to add another wrinkle to the story, the project had been operating on a 50-year-old power rate through Pacific Core that was negotiated when Link River Dam went in. And that power rate for the project irrigators expired, I think it was in the early 2000s somewhere. And so their power rates shot through the ceiling. And so there was another incentive to be much more efficient with water use. You couldn't afford to pump it like you used to. You couldn't afford to pump it from Tule Lake over to Lower Klamath, for example. So it was a perfect storm. What we went from too much water in the 80s, how do we get rid of all this stuff, to not getting any. It really was tough.
And so that's a reflection, as you mentioned, of changing water priorities. And then when you layer onto that, you might say an environmental almost disaster that occurred in the early 2000s, things became more serious even still. So 2001, I believe, was the date of another significant event in terms of a very severe drought that brought additional attention to some of the water woes in that region. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And that was a mathematical certainty that was going to happen sooner or later. And that, there was a biological opinion to mandate certain levels in Upper Klamath Lake to protect the suckers. There was mandated river flows in the Klamath to protect the salmon. And sooner or later, there isn't going to be enough water to go around. And 2001 was a very, very dry year. And the Bureau came out in the spring and said that the project's not going to be able to operate this year.
Mark, I know I've heard you tell this story about some fairly noteworthy protests that occurred in 2001. Tell us a little bit about those.
Well, actually, Mike, Dave would be much more familiar with those than me because he lived right there in Klamath Falls and would have seen that all up close. And I'll offer a couple observations, but essentially, as Dave said, there was no water for Dave. I suppose at that time would have been about 230,000 acres of farmland, right? That would have required that irrigation water, and there wasn't going to be any water for. So obviously, Mike, there was a lot of the local agricultural community was very upset. To my knowledge, they actually, Dave, did they chain the canal, or they chained the valve that essentially released water into the drainage canal? Correct.
They did. I think originally, as I remember, some of the irrigators did go and open the gates.
Right. Open the irrigation gates, which had been locked shut, to my understanding.
Right, and then the Bureau basically had to post, I believe, federal agents there to keep those gates closed. And then there was pretty much a protest all summer there at the gates. It certainly made the national news.
Mike, it actually only really slipped from the national news when 9/11 occurred, which, of course, took over coverage of everything. But yeah, it was a lot of national attention there in 2001 when that happened.
Yeah, I will say I'll hand it to the irrigators. They worked overtime to try to get their message across in a peaceful way. And that's important because you see so many protests nowadays that turn otherwise. And they were they were successful in making sure that their message was about ESA and agricultural water.
Right. I think they formed, Dave, what was it? The Bucket Brigade they formed, and which was, I believe they well, you can explain it better than I can, but it was kind of representation for, they filled 50 buckets full of water. Each bucket, I think, represented one state in the Union.
I think so. They basically transported water by a chain of people from the Klamath River over to the A Canal, the main irrigation canal for the project, kind of as a symbolic parade and gesture. And yeah, there might have been the 50 buckets you're talking about. I'm not sure, but yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I think I recall that. It's been a long time, but I do remember visiting the basin during that summer when all that was going on.
And this is a good point, and probably a good time to say this. I kind of intended to do this early on, but Mark, I know I've seen you use this language, and I think maybe it might even be in a forthcoming article of yours in the Ducks Unlimited magazine about this particular topic. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have this particular series of episodes, to add a bit more detail to this story. But we certainly want to avoid sending the message that there are any bad actors here. That's not at all what we're saying. Sometimes things happen, things develop through time, and you're left with a series of circumstances that just don't work out for all the interests that are involved there. So certainly we don't. I think we've avoided trying to paint anyone as a bad actor here, and we certainly don't want to do that. We're just trying to describe the situation and represent all the different interests that are at play. And of course, we come at this from an angle of an interest in waterfowl habitat conservation, and we're trying to figure out a way to make that happen amidst all the other competing interests. Is that kind of fair way to characterize it, Mark?
Yeah, Mike, even though the story is 100 years old now, there are no villains in this story. In the end, it's just not enough water to go around in an arid landscape, especially now that we have, 3 species of fish that have found their way onto the endangered species list. But there are no villains here. It's simply too little water in an arid landscape at this point in time.
Yeah, it is. It's like, the project was set up for the values in 1905 that were important to people, and that was making use of lands that were deemed of low value, i.e. wetlands, and putting them to a higher value. And then you take that same infrastructure and those same laws and the same operating system, you transport it forward in time to the 21st century, and people start scratching their heads.
Well, we are sort of on the time scale here up to the early 2000s. And I know one of the other significant milestones occurs in 2020. Actually, I guess it would have started prior to 2020, but we certainly want to spend some time on that. And I think we have enough material here to justify a third episode. I believe I started out the first episode saying we're going to have a couple of 2 episodes, but as sometimes occurs, the story is a bit more interesting and challenging and complex that requires more time. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode here, Dave and Mark. So thank you guys again for joining us, and we're going to resume again with episode 3. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Appreciate the invite.
We again extend special thanks to our guests on this episode, Dr. Dave Mauser and Dr. Mark Petrie, 2 guys that have spent a lot of time in the West and that know the issues around the Klamath Basin very, very well, and we appreciate them sharing this information with us. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, our very own digital warrior, for all the great work that he does editing these podcasts. And of course, to you, the listener, we thank you for spending your time with us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.